Following months of discussion by students and activists in late 1967, the Atlanta Cooperative News Project was created to publish news and perspectives largely ignored or shunned by the established media in the city. The cooperative legal structure was chosen specifically to ensure and enhance a democratic and bottom-up business and editorial structure of the eventual publication. The first birdhouse was at 184 14th Street Northeast, across from the soon-to-be-constructed Colony Square on Peachtree Street. The birdhouse and the Catacombs, a music venue, anchored the north end of the strip on Peachtree. The Stein Club at 7th and Peachtree was the southern tip. The start of the Bird coincided with an emerging youth counterculture self-identified as hippies, who named and congregated on the strip. For many of those young people, Atlanta became either home or a stop on the way to San Francisco in the 1968 Summer of Love. Either way, the Bird was a source of income for them, and they provided the paper with a steady supply of street vendors and an occasional cover photo. The Co-op published the first issue of The Great Speckled Bird on March 15, 1968. This issue was typewritten in all black with justified columns, looking much like a small and inexpert version of the straight press it intended to challenge. The black and white format was maintained for the first 7 issues of the paper. Adjusting to an emerging and often flamboyant youth culture, as well as adapting to the challenge of street sales, the Bird soon adopted a colorful full-page cover format. The familiar masthead appeared on issue 10 of the then bi-weekly paper. The Bird came out as a weekly in mid-September 1968, quickly becoming a leader in the emergence of over 500 alternative or underground newspapers in the U.S. in the late 60s and early 70s. Like its sister papers, the Bird covered news and offered perspectives ignored, lied about, or shunned by the establishment or straight press, including the promotion of marijuana, LSD, and other psychedelic drugs, in addition to coverage of labor struggles, the Vietnam War, other national liberation struggles, the Black liberation movement, the gay and women's movement as they emerged, and the music that this cultural and political ferment inspired. Though often standalone graphics not tied to specific articles inside, the covers of the Bird reflect the history of the paper as well as the emergence and decline of the hippie counterculture and the struggles of the varied political movements of the era. As soon as the paper began publication, graphic artists both young and well-established began offering their works. Operating on a shoestring, the Bird welcomed their artistic talent and offered exposure and an outlet for creative expression, but no money. On more than one occasion, an exciting graphic submitted during an all-night layout session would be voted to replace a cover chosen at an earlier editorial meeting. As with artwork, the Bird Cooperative did not pay for photographs, having decided early on that creative work was its own reward, and only the shit work of producing the paper deserved what little money was available. Nevertheless, numerous talented photographers donated their work to the paper without complaint. Often they would experiment with double exposures or other techniques, or depict a sense of alternative reality. Underground comics were popular in this era, and the Bird had a number of great cartoonists willing to share their work. As with other cover options, the comic covers were discussed and voted upon by the entire staff in co-op editorial meetings. If you worked on an issue, you could participate and vote at these meetings, and your name would be included in the staff box. Over 300 people are listed in the staff box from 1968 through 1976, though many appear in only 1 or 2 issues. The Bird was a paper of resistance against war and militarism, racial oppression, misogyny, homophobia, mass incarceration, and most of the other ills that continue to plague the U.S. Bird covers reflect this resistance and their countervailing responses, decrying the Vietnam War and supporting anti-war individuals and demonstrations, lambasting police brutality while extolling peaceful protest, reporting atrocity while defending effective response. Not too surprisingly, the Bird managed to garner a few detractors and enemies. Street sellers were arrested, charged with panhandling, obstructing traffic, or selling without a permit. High school students were suspended for distributing or just possessing the paper. The U.S. Postal Service refused to mail an issue because it had an ad for an abortion clinic. The paper itself was busted for obscenity after it angered Atlanta icon Coca-Cola by publishing the famous Up Against the Wall cover, a frame from a Spain Rodriguez cartoon. Though distracting and time-consuming, these First Amendment legal battles were won in municipal, state, and federal courts by attorneys Al Horn and Reber Bolt, with the assistance from the ACLU of Georgia. Local politics also threatened the Bird when our first printer, New Era Publishing in Decatur, abruptly canceled its contract after a scurrilous broadside printed by an anonymous DeKalb League for Decency attacked its owner, who was running for office at the time. The Bird responded with an art cover and centerfold hilariously satirizing the pious sanctimony of the League of Decency. The next week, the Great Speckled Bird quoted the biblical passage that inspired its name, becoming perhaps the only underground publication of the era to quote Scripture on its cover. It also did not miss its printing deadline, air freighting its layout sheets to New Orleans and trucking the papers to Atlanta via a film distributor for a few issues. A closer printer was found in Montgomery, Alabama. For most of its life, layout sheets were driven to Montgomery early Thursday morning, and the papers trucked back that night for Friday distribution. Most seriously, in 1972, the Birdhouse, then on Westminster Avenue just north of the Atlanta Botanical Gardens, was firebombed. The office was gutted, and records, equipment, and supplies were destroyed. The APD declared arson as the cause of the fire, but declined to investigate further. No one was ever charged in this terroristic action. The paper survived the attack, again, never missing or delaying an issue. The effect of the fire was serious, however, forcing the paper to fragment functions and reduce staff before another office could be rented on Juniper Street. Unconstitutional harassment did not cease. Savannah and Macon passed laws banning the paper from their cities. Governor Lester Maddox banned bird boxes from the state capitol. Attempts were made to deny the paper's sale at the airport. Less direct threats also challenged the Bird, including war weariness and despair as the Vietnam War encompassed Southeast Asia, and closer to home, the counterculture of the Strip hardened and became more desperate as heroin and methamphetamine replaced the pot and acid of the peace and love youth movement. In early 1974, the Bird shifted to a more local news format, with a less dominant masthead and more written copy on the cover. These changes did not bring necessary financial stability, but even the return of more colorful and graphic covers in 1975, changing times signaled the eventual demise of the paper. In response to declining street sales and increased competition for ad revenue, the Bird in 1975 reduced staff again and became a free paper. In survival mode, the Bird experimented with a new format and monthly publication schedule in 1976, but was unable to overcome its advertising and distribution problems. For its final issue, the Bird reverted to its full-page graphic cover, but with the masthead printed at the bottom of the paper. It was published on October 1st, 1976, ending a 7.5-year run of uninterrupted publication. This short history of the Great Speckled Bird does not do justice to the thematic breadth and depth of this vibrant newspaper. Next, we look at the major themes addressed in the Bird. Opposition to the war on Vietnam drove the creation of and remained the central focus of the paper as U.S. aggression expanded to Laos and Cambodia. Guts and glory militarism dominated the Atlanta press in 1968, mocked in this cover, welcoming the opening in Atlanta of John Wayne's propaganda film, The Green Beret. The Bird tried to counter the lies that undergirded the gauzy myths about U.S. aggression in Southeast Asia, in its writing and graphics, but also in its active involvement in the often fractious coalitions formed to call for street demonstrations. Byrd staff helped plan for these demonstrations, promoted them in advance, actively participated, and then wrote up their experiences for the paper. Though rejecting the war's aims and condemning its leadership and lies, Byrd's support for the GI boots on the ground was unwavering. Active duty service people, both in the U.S. and abroad, were offered free copies and half-price subscriptions, which were readily accepted. The paper was passed from hand to hand and read widely in the war zones. In addition to covers, the Byrd provided a continuous stream of articles and graphics about the war from multiple sources, including independent journalists, sister underground publications, and Liberation News Service, which distributed packets of stories and images to underground papers throughout the nation on a weekly basis. This line drawing of Ho Chi Minh appeared on the cover in 1969, giving a rare positive portrayal in the U.S. of the beloved father of the Vietnam Revolution, whose armies had defeated the French colonialists and were now fighting the U.S. and its allies. This cover uses an iconic image of a Vietnamese woman soldier that appeared on a Vietnamese postage stamp. As Nixon and Kissinger cynically escalated the war into Laos and Cambodia, Byrd coverage of the now Indochina War also expanded. As the death toll rapidly mounted and the lies of the administration were increasingly exposed, anti-war actions and demonstrations increased even in Atlanta and other previously quiescent southern cities. Nixon's campaign slogan, "4 more years," garnered an appropriate, if despairing, response in the Byrd. As American aggression against Vietnam was exposed, respect and support for the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam increased, as shown in this cover from 1972. More demonstrations were mobilized after Nixon's re-election under false promises of peace. By the end of 1973, Nixon's multiple crimes were manifest. The Byrd was among the first to call for his impeachment. Vietnam and the war in Indochina were dominant cover themes, but struggles for freedom in other nations were also prominent. This beautiful cover belies the horrors described on the inside by 2 staff members who toured Palestinian refugee camps under heavy Israeli bombing in October 1970. Several Byrd staffers joined the International Venceremos Brigades to cut cane and experience life in Cuba during the U.S. embargo of the island nation. Richard Nixon may have opened the official door to China, but the Little Red Book and other writings of Chairman Mao had more resonance with the Byrd than any dogma coming out of Washington, D.C. at the time. Gulf Oil held a shareholders meeting in Atlanta in April 1971, giving the Byrd opportunity to support demonstrations against the company's racist exploitation of Angola and expose support of the Gulf Oil Company in Emory University's stock portfolio. This Cuban-produced poster links the cover to an article inside about the strike of over 20,000 Namibian contract laborers protesting occupation by the South African apartheid regime and support it received from U.S. companies and the U.S. government. Chilean President Salvador Allende was overthrown and assassinated by a U.S.-sponsored coup led by General Augusto Pinochet in September 1973. This April 1974 cover announced an in-depth interview with Dr. Jim Ritter, an American professor who witnessed the coup while in Santiago, Chile. The ongoing civil rights and intensifying Black liberation struggles of the late 60s and early 70s opened windows of consciousness and stirrings of activism among many diverse groupings of people, from Chicano farm workers to privileged white students at elite universities, all covered in the pages of the Byrd. By 1969, the Byrd began to respond to the growing national movement for women's liberation. Besides covering national issues, the Byrd women formed a women's caucus intent on overcoming male privilege and dominance at the paper. Traditional Mother's Day was ignored in Byrd covers, perhaps because the holiday's militant anti-war beginnings have been smothered by syrupy motherhood platitudes. But several covers celebrate International Women's Day beginning with the whimsical Peace Mother cartoon of February 28, 1969. Such passive and soft imagery, however whimsical, was soon abandoned in favor of portraying active and powerful women. True to its activist perspective, Women of the Bird helped organize and participated in a short-lived women's festival in Atlanta, announced on this cover. Another International Women's Day cover in 1972 links women's liberation and Black liberation, with its focus on Angela Davis. The 1973 International Women's Day cover was preceded the week before by a focus on the Equal Rights Amendment being debated in state legislatures nationwide. A cover from 1974 on International Women's Day focuses on self-defense against rape and announces a suit against the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce for sexual harassment. Topics as widely discussed in the media today as they were hidden and ignored in most of the straight press of the time. The cover of a Bird staffer nursing her baby, perhaps unremarkable today, was risque and controversial at the time. The Bird was the first newspaper in Georgia to publicize and print the forms for do-it-yourself divorce in December 1973, contributing to a dramatic spike in the divorce rate in the state. The women's liberation movement was also linked to and inspired by national liberation struggles, attested to by this Women in Revolt cover in October 1972, depicting and celebrating the women in revolt fighting the U.S. in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Day-to-day organizing in the workplace may have produced less adrenaline than fighting on the battlefield, but the raised fist of militant struggle was also adopted by the feminist movement of the time. The militant out-of-the-closet movement to end discrimination against LGBT people in the U.S. ignited into public consciousness with a fight-back brawl against the New York police at the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street on June 28, 1969. The gay liberation movement was chronicled and actively supported in the pages of the Bird. It also produced two covers. The first, on June 28, 1971, told the story of the Christopher Street Fightback and announced a Smash Gay Oppression March that would morph into Atlanta's annual Gay Pride Parade. The second, a year later, announced an entire week of Gay Pride events, including a press conference, a dance, and a theatrical performance, as well as a Gay Pride Week march. As with other movements, Bird staff helped organize these events, publicized them, participated in them, and then wrote about and photographed them as they occurred. After much internal debate, the third issue of the Bird responded to the April 14, 1968 assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This cover features Don Stone, a local and national leader in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, on the eve of his incarceration in the federal penitentiary to serve a 2-year sentence for obstructing the selective service, stemming from a draft board demonstration in 1966 in which he and 20 others had been arrested. As Stone says, "Brothers and sisters, we are in a time that we are seeing every day all of our most promising leaders either assassinated, locked up, or driven into exile. Huey Newton, jailed. Angela Davis, jailed. George Jackson, murdered." This demonstration in July 1970 was called by the Christian Liberation Front of Augusta, Georgia, 2 months after 6 Black men were shot in the back in a riot protesting the police killing of a Black 16-year-old in the Augusta City Jail. As we see here, police killings of unarmed people in the streets are not new. Other racial groups, including the Detroit-based White Panthers and the Puerto Rican Young Lords in New York, were given coverage in the Bird. This cover honors the Native American encampment at Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1973. As with other national and international movements, the Bird did not pretend to be objective or tell both sides in its labor reporting, but was unabashedly pro-worker and pro-union. In this cover from September 1968, the Resurgens Atlanta city seal is altered to Regurgens Atlanta and superimposed on a garbage can to focus attention on a strike by city sanitation workers. Sanitation workers struck again in 1970, an action covered extensively in The Bird. These covers are from March 30th and April 13th, 1970. The Bird supported strikes and nationwide boycotts called by the United Farm Workers led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in California, and actions by migrant workers in Florida, both in 1972. Also in 1972, Bird covers focused attention on a strike at the Fulton Cotton Mill in Cabbagetown, the first in its 103-year history, and on a strike organized by the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers and supported by the North Georgia Building Trades against the Georgia Power Company. Drastic increases in fuel prices in 1974 resulted in independent trucker shutdowns, marches, and demonstrations nationwide, including in Atlanta. Like the Strip on Peachtree, Piedmont Park became a natural gathering place for hippies, who celebrated their awakening with free food, flying frisbees, and lots of impromptu music. The Allman Brothers Band debuted in Atlanta with a free concert in Piedmont Park in April 1969, an all-day, all-night experience that convinced many that rock and roll was a powerful force for radical change in the U.S. This perspective was reinforced a year later at the second annual Atlanta Pop Festival, a 3-day people's assembly of dope, art, and loud music held in Byron, Georgia over a sweltering 4th of July weekend. Traditional Southern music was also celebrated in Bird covers, as with this cover of Mississippi Fred McDowell performing at the Memphis Blues Festival in June 1969. Anne Romaine, co-founder of both The Bird and the Southern Folk Cultural Revival Project, brought multiracial blues and Appalachian folk music to college campuses throughout the South. Southern musical roots are wide and deep, and The Bird was as likely to cover old-timey music at the Shoal Creek Music Festival in August 1970 as it was the modern country of Porter Wagoner and Dolly Parton in May 1971. Of course, no music coverage of the era would be complete without acknowledging Bob Dylan, whose cover photo accompanied a review of his just-released New Morning album. Much of what the Great Speckled Bird published in its 401-issue lifespan is not acknowledged in this partial review of Bird covers. The Bird would not have been The Bird, however, without staff cartoonists like Ron Alspern and Steve Abbott. Enjoy.